The New York City Commission on Human Rights does not provide legal advice. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the individuals and do not necessarily reflect the views or position of the Commission. Enjoy the show.
Hello, New York City. Welcome to another episode of Rights Here, Right Now, from the New York City Commission on Human Rights. I'm your host, Jose Rios Lua. Pronouns are he, him, Chief of Staff at the Commission. Rights Here, Right Now airs on the last Monday of every month on WHCR 90.3 FM. Each episode will give listeners the info they'll need to live, work, and thrive free from discrimination in our city. All episodes will also be posted on the Commission's website, YouTube channel, and now you can find past episodes on Spotify. As always, before we dive into our show's topic, here's a little background information on our agency. The New York City Commission on Human Rights is the city's agency that protects New Yorkers from discrimination in employment, housing, and public spaces. The Commission is charged with enforcing the city's human rights law, one of the broadest civil rights laws in the nation. The law prohibits discrimination against over 25 protected categories such as race, age, gender identity, sexuality, nation of origin, and immigration status. New Yorkers can report discrimination to the Commission by calling 212-416-0197 or visiting our website at nyc.gov/humanrights. The Commission also seeks to prevent discrimination and conduct outreach to educate New Yorkers on their rights and responsibilities under the law. The Commission provides trainings and workshops that detail the protections enshrined in the law. Our trainings are grounded in the idea that our rights are interconnected and that we all have a role to play to advance equity in New York City. You can request a training by visiting our website. Again, that's nyc.gov/humanrights. As always, I'm joined by the Commission's Deputy Commissioner of Policy and External Affairs, Joanne Camaford. And Joanne, we have a third co-host today.
Yes, today we're joined by the Commission's Urban Fellow, Leela Cullity Younger, who we will hear from more later. Welcome to the show, Leela.
Thank you so much for having me.
Recently, we hosted our second Human Rights Summit, and one of the presentations there focused on supporting transgender and gender nonconforming communities. The summit brought together a set of diverse stakeholders to uplift protections of our city's most vulnerable populations. One of those presenters included Matthew McCauley, a licensed clinical social worker at the Oval Center at Montefiore Medical Center, to explore critical supports needed for LGBTQIA+ communities, with a special emphasis on transgender and gender nonconforming folks. Drawing from his extensive experience in clinical social work, Matthew provides insight into the work of the Oval Center and its ongoing efforts to uplift and serve the most vulnerable while addressing common misconceptions using historical evidence to affirm the long-standing existence of TGNC folks and gain practical tools to counter harmful narratives and learn actionable ways to advocate for and support the community. And it doesn't hurt that on top of all of his clinical work, Matt's also an attorney. So please join me in welcoming to the show, Matthew McCauley.
Hello, thank you for having me. What a wonderful introduction. Whoever wrote that is brilliant.
well, Matt, before we jump into the substance of things, we have one question we ask every guest of the show, and that is, what is your favorite thing to do in New York City?
So for me personally, I love to see great drag performances, and New York City has some of the best drag artists in the world, and we attract some of the best art that drag has to offer that comes here. So if you're in New York City, look around for a drag show. I promise you'll have your mind blown. On the other hand, if you live in New York City year-round, I also highly recommend the Bronx too. If you've never been, you have to go. If you have a 7-year-old nephew like I do, bring them along because they're at the time of their life. They're open year-round. They have great hours, really affordable parking if you drive. It's not so friendly to folks who are not fully able-bodied. That is real. But if you have implements, you can bring them along. There are lots of flat surfaces to push, and we will talk also.
Tell us some more about your background and what inspired you personally to work at the intersection of law, social work, and advocacy for LGBTQIA+ communities.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a little bit of low-hanging fruit to say I had no other choice, but on some level I had no other choice. I identify as a gay man. I'm out to everyone who knows me, and now everyone listens to this radio show, so happy me. I grew up in a town called Saginaw, Michigan, about an hour and a half or 2 hours of traffic north of Detroit, and it was a really nice place to grow up, but it was also a very complicated place to grow up in that it had a lot of interesting kind of social politics. When I was growing up, it was one of the most de facto segregated cities in the country. There's a river that runs down the middle of Saginaw, Michigan, that literally separates how folks live based on race. It is slowly but surely been changing, but that dynamic creates a space in which you learn certain things a certain way. So I went to Catholic school in that place also. So I came out of all of that with what I thought was a really kind of holistic, large-scale understanding of the world. I was comedically wrong, but that's what I thought. So then I got out of college, thought maybe I'd be an opera singer for a minute. I know I was comedically wrong again. That's the theme of my life. And then I decided to go to law school. And when I went to law school, I started practicing law afterward. I moved to New York City when I passed the bar exam here in New Jersey as well. And in practicing law, I tried to really focus my work whenever possible on the LGBTQIA plus community. That's my community. Those are my people. I want to work from what I know. But even in doing what was mostly personal injury and medical malpractice law, the opportunities still felt kind of far and few between. And the people I was helping their pocketbooks more than I was able to really help their mental well-being or help them feel better when they woke up tomorrow. I mean, being able to feel financially solvent and responsible is wonderful, but a lot of times the things I was doing in the law were temporary. I'd get someone a settlement that they would have, but when that was gone, they'd go right back to where they were. And so I started thinking about how I could help people in different and more alternative ways, and that was how social work came to me. I also had a wonderful social worker as a therapist at the time who really helped inspire me. And so I went back to social work, and social work has felt right ever since. But what's beautiful and kind of fabulous now is I get to live in this intersection because I can speak lawyer fluently. I was raised in the dark like them, but I now get to live out in these streets as a social worker and help people's holistic self. I can help make referrals that help them with things like their legal problems, but I can also talk to them about their feelings and about how to feel better and how to have better tools and how to do things like that. And then, on top of all of that, it lets me come and do things like this today, where I can come and talk to you as an expert in sexuality and gender identity, but also be able to talk to you about how the Supremacy Clause is going to be a big part of our fight, or how we can talk about constitutionality, things like that. So I never really had an option, but I'm so grateful that I took the path that I did, because now I sit here able to talk to you about how you feel, why you feel that way, and what you can do on a meta, meso, and micro level for yourself to help with that.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about what the Oval Center does and what kinds of services and resources it provides.
Yes, so the Oval Center is part of Montefiore Medical Center, kind of larger hospital system. The Oval Center is our one-stop shop sexual health clinic. It does full spectrum sexual health testing and treatment. We also provide gender-affirming care there, meaning for anyone who's 18 or over, we are an adult clinic. You can come there and get gender-affirming services like hormones. You can get letters or evals for gender-affirming surgeries, things like that. But fundamentally, again, anyone and everyone is welcome to come to the Oval Center for sexual health. And I'm also the mental health provider there. So if you are an existing patient otherwise, you also could get mental health services there under the auspices of yours truly.
I think we want to spend a little bit of time also unpacking some of the challenges that communities are facing. So I would love to hear your thoughts from where you sit. What are some of the challenges and risks that queer and TGNC communities face today?
So the biggest challenges at the moment are existential ones that are coming, at least in the United States, from the federal government. Just this past weekend, the federal government stopped issuing passports with the X gender marker designation on it. My spouse's passport has an X on it. My spouse identifies as non-binary. The federal government just told them that they don't exist anymore. That's a threat. Actually, that's not a threat. That's an overt action. So challenges like that, the challenges and risks facing queer and TGNC folks are existential at this point. They also are challenging potentially our right to be married. So we elected our first ever transgender member of Congress this past election cycle, and before she'd even had the chance to be inaugurated, Congress made a rule saying that Congress people had to use the gender's bathrooms assigned to them at birth. The irony is that Congress people get private bathrooms, so that law didn't even mean anything, or that rule, excuse me. But that's the point. They're making rules that don't even have any actual meaning because their goal is not to actually regulate, it's to erase us. That's the challenge and the risk. They don't want us regulated, they want us gone. but we've never not existed and we're never not going to, and that's the whole point. So those are the big challenges of this. And I have recently seen, actually, from my own home state, sorry to call out Michigan, but one of Michigan's Republican elected Congress people from their state Congress, not the federal government, tweeted after the election that they thought maybe they should be reconsidering the right to be for gay marriage. So I don't want to say that's off the table either. And all this gender identity stuff that's in the mix that they're attacking now was all clearly laid out in Project 2025. They're just doing it now. So they also called their pitch, and here we are watching them swing away at it.
I think one of the things that you highlighted in your presentation at the summit that has been true for many years is that one of the big risks to these communities is erasure. Some of the work that you've been doing, your goal is to dispel misconceptions about TGNC folks and the queer community. And so what are some common myths you encounter, and how do you counter them with historical evidence?
A lot of the myths I encounter now are things like the idea that we are this newfangled idea, or maybe we are, God forbid, quote unquote, woke, right? Which is the idea that all these things are new and not based in history or haven't always been around, or these newfangled ideas. And if we just return to a more traditional, air quotes, time, everything would be better. The problem is that queer people have always been around, trans folks have always been around. So the myth that we are new is not evidence in history. For example, my favorite one, pre-colony United States. So in this country, on this land where we all live, when indigenous people still occupied it, the original people who were here, 150 separate tribes in what we now know as the United States codified and respected a third gender. They didn't know about one another necessarily. It wasn't like a hive mind thing. It was just normalized that there were people who didn't normatively fit into male and female, because that's always been the case in history. But that's not how they talk about it now. They want it to seem like we're new. We're not. Another example, Elagabalus was a Roman emperor, Roman empress, who was a priestess. She died at like 18, so she didn't rule for very long. But she was assigned male at birth, but renowned to only wear women's clothing. She insisted people call her empress, not emperor. She also insisted on being called a priestess, not priest. So, and this was in like 300 BCE. So these are people who existed forever. The problem is that the people who tend to collect history have to want to remember these people, and they often don't. So like Elagabalus, I mentioned, even the Roman Empire tried to erase her from history. They just were unsuccessful. That's real. This also reminds me of 1933. One of the first things the Nazis did was burn an important research center for gender and sexuality studies. One of the first places they went, they burned everything to the ground. He was one of the first surgeons to ever perform gender surgery, and the Nazis ensured that his research was destroyed and had to be recreated from scratch, because they are so afraid that our existence might be ratified, but we've always existed.
I think one of the things that is really confusing to people, and then, as we know, things that are confusing become scary just because we don't know about them, is this concept of what gender-affirming care is, because people think that gender-affirming care just right off the bat means there's surgery involved, and that's not true, right?
That's exactly right. Gender-affirming care does not mean surgery at all. Gender-affirming care, I mean, the World Health Organization basically says if anything that affirms and supports a person's gender identity as they express it to you. All gender-affirming care is basically the opposite of what the federal government's trying to do. It's just acknowledging that you don't have to fit neatly into two sexes to be a human being who exists. And again, history supports that. People have never fit neatly into two sexes. I mean, even the most recent executive order on its face doesn't work, because intersex kids exist. Intersex children are people who were born at birth with a variation of their body that doesn't match, whether their genitals and their hormones don't match equally. So like a person could have a penis but no testes. They could have a uterus and a penis. These are intersex people who are not assigned male or female at birth, but are instead often surgically intervened on as children. Those are not trans people. Those are cis kids who are being surgically intervened on against their will. No one's saying anything about them. But that's exactly, again, the point, because this is all mythos.
And I think there's also a big portion of this that people don't understand, that there are people whose gender align with their sex assigned as birth, so what we would traditionally call cisgender folks, who engage in gender-affirming care every single day, right? There are people who engage in hormones, hair loss, all of those pieces, right?
Absolutely. Wearing a beard is gender affirming on men. For many women, shaving their legs can be gender affirming, or shaving their armpits can be gender affirming. We do gender affirming stuff for cisgender people all of the time.
I just think that that's one of the things that people's fear about the term gender affirming care, or when we talk about these concepts, is because they truly just don't understand that this phrase means a lot of things that we do every single day. And with that, I'll hand it over to Leela.
Our next question for you is, what are some actionable ways individuals and communities can become better allies?
Listen to programs like this, educate yourself, go out and pick up some great reading on the topic. I encourage you to read the readings of Susan Stryker, Jules Gill Peterson. They're both very prominent, brilliant trans authors and advocates and scholars. I also encourage you to join your local PFLAG, which is for parents and friends of lesbians and gay people. They also include trans folks there. Join a march, go to your local Pride event, and look within arm's reach for things you can actually do differently. Put up a little sign at your house that says TGNC folks are safe here, so your neighbors know it's safe there too. You never know. At my house, I live in Brockneck. My husband and I put out a Pride flag. It was the first one in our neighborhood. A week later, 3 houses down, a neighbor put up a New York Jets Pride flag, which was inspired because we put ours out. It turns out they're queer. We had no idea. And we just turned out making friends because we were putting out our supportive things at our home. Also, look for ways to have these conversations with folks who you know have outdated or harmful thinking about it. Don't be afraid to move toward, respectfully, folks who you know have some kind of backwards ideas about us, and have some of those conversations.
That point that you just made is one we'd love to dig into a little bit. We come across lots of circumstances where people don't know how to start a conversation. Yep. So would love any pointers you have for listeners about how to navigate conversations with people who may hold harmful or outdated views, or where you're not sure what people's views are. Because I think generally we've gotten less good at listening as a people, and so thinking about how to make the space for both listening and learning.
I grew up in a time where being able to say, like, agree to disagree was a lot more normative than it is now. We talk about it like it still exists, but one of the things that's so challenging today is that these conversations wind up becoming, forgive the use of the phrase, identity politics, right? Talking with someone about this, suddenly, like for me, when I'm talking about the gay community, for instance, I'm not talking about this like academic grouping of people in the back of my mind. I'm talking about me. I'm talking about my spouse at home. I'm talking about my friends who I see out in the streets for a drink because we're afraid of what's going to come next down the street. So I kind of try to keep that in the back of my mind when I talk to folks who I think have ideas different than mine. Because homophobia and transphobia are phobias. They come from fear. People are afraid that letting this happen is going to do something negative to them. So one of the things I really tell people to remember when you're going to have what might be a difficult conversation, take a really long breath. You have all your tools with you. And then try to take a really neutral, or if possible, sort of humble stance. Ask a lot of permission. Hey, would it be okay if I ask you some questions about this thing? Would it be okay if I asked you about this? Would it be okay if we talked about this a little bit more? Hey, I was hoping I could help you think a little bit differently about the LGBTQI plus community. Would you be open to that today? And if they say no, that's okay. That is okay. We are not trying to force people to have these conversations when they're not ready. That is exactly what the other side is doing, and that's why it's wrong, right? We are trying to show that we can move through these streets in a way where we can have these conversations with people when they're ready, and we can stay ready to have them when they are. So that's the first. Once you're in the conversations, be ready to step away if you have to. If someone becomes too triggered, if someone becomes too upset, if someone starts becoming aggressive with you, if you're not able to bring them back down, hey, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to offend you. I'm trying to have an innocent conversation. It's okay if we don't want to keep talking about this, talk about something else. That's okay. Think about having these conversations also in spaces where you're physically safe. If it's with someone who you know might get a little wild and go left on you, really fair to take them to your local cafe to do it instead of doing it in the privacy of your own home. But the big thing is that when you're willing to have these conversations with people, the fact that you're willing to sit in that discomfort with them is sometimes all it takes, because a lot of people, I've also found, are embarrassed that they feel this way. and they're afraid of being shamed if they change their mind. That's the other part about it. We get to, as people who acknowledge that everyone is allowed to identify how they please, we get to acknowledge that these folks get to identify this way also, but we can help them feel better by having them feel like they have a more open mind and open stance, so they can experience more of what the world has to give them, not just what their narrow worldview is letting them see now.
When you were presenting at the summit, and even just hearing you talk about this again today, my mind goes to like having someone tell me, you know, before you call someone out, try calling them in first, and take that approach when you're having that conversation. Like everything you're saying is like just saying like, you know, have that grace, have understanding. Like even like assuming positive intent when talking to somebody goes a long way, right?
Absolutely. But I also will say, thank you for that, Jose, but I also will say, remember though, we cannot be inclusive to the exclusion of ourselves, right? There's that gif of that guy punching that Nazi in the face. You've probably all seen online someplace. I'm not advocating violence in this space, and I never would, ever. Violence is not the move. I want to advocate, though, inclusion of someone wearing a Nazi armband, for instance, in spaces is not what we're talking about here. That is to the extreme of this thing. Inclusion does not mean bringing every fox into the hen house who you know is there to harm you. That's important too. I want to really name that in this moment. So thank you for reminding me of that.
I think that's also just brings up the like importance of knowing our own like limitations, right? And taking care of ourselves, of like knowing where there are spaces where you can have conversations and where there are spaces where you probably shouldn't have conversations on your own.
Well, yes, and sometimes those are spaces to be ready for when that time comes. Like my mother is the perfect example. She was not ready the first time we tried to talk about my sexuality. She wasn't. She was from Staten Island, Michigan herself. She had never met a gay person until she knew me. And she didn't even know about me for like 20 years. But we came back to it down the line. And now she is the most advocacy mother on earth. She is a mother to my husband also. I mean, my mom is like P-flag down, but she's a great example of that. She wasn't ready the first time. But I didn't cut her out because of that. I just was like, okay, I'll be ready the next time because I know that my mother is afraid. She's not hateful. That's an important distinction for her.
Looking ahead, what gives you hope for the future of advocacy and support for LGBTQIA plus communities?
I mean, honestly, seeing people like my mom change, legit. My mother is like on paper what people think about, I think, when they think of like the Midwest, air quotes, right? Yeah. She was born and raised there. She went to college there. She never left. Met my dad there. They got married. They had a kid there, have a house there, retired there. Her whole life has taken place in Michigan with the exception of like 4 times a year where she comes to stay with me for a week. But she has slowly but surely broadened her horizons because she just had not been exposed to some of these things. And as soon as they were, I mean, now, one of my mom's favorite shows is RuPaul's Drag Race.
Yeah.
Right, which, I mean, even I can't say now, like there's too many seasons, whatever. But, you know, she has come a long way. The other thing that gives me so much hope is seeing the kids these days who can have talks like this at like 19. I mentioned my 7-year-old nephew. There's a kid in his class who identifies as non-binary. My 7-year-old nephew can use they, them pronouns better than anyone I know. He does it better than I do. And I am an expert in gender and sexuality. So I'm also encouraged to see that in these spaces, in schools, with kids, like the younger generation, they see us. They see us struggle and they see Dylan do this again. So I'm also really encouraged by seeing kids coming up in spaces where not only are they affirmed, even if they are trans or cisgender, but also they come up in spaces where this language and these ideas are normative to them and they don't feel like they're new or wild. They're just everyday like everything else.
Matt, thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing your thoughts and your experience in this field. We really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Keep
Thanks.
the fight up.
If fear and hate are learned behaviors, they can be unlearned. And we're no stranger to protecting LGBTQIA plus communities. There's been protections in our laws for a while, right, Joanne?
Yeah, so I think it's perfect to remind folks about what the New York City human rights law says today. So in New York City, it is illegal to discriminate based on actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender. And discrimination because of gender includes discrimination based on gender identity or expression or being intersex, all things that Matt just talked about. The protections cover most of the areas anyone goes during their day. That's work, that's school, it's housing, and it's public spaces such as restaurants, movie theaters, and parks. And of course, contact the commission if you think you have experienced discrimination. And for anyone interested in learning more about the topics that we're talking about, we also have a treasure trove of legal enforcement guidance on our website that explains details about these protections, scenarios of what violations of the law look like. nyc.gov/human rights.
Earlier in January, we hosted our second annual New York City Human Rights Summit. This event brought together hundreds of stakeholders, including policymakers, advocates, legal service providers, and community members, both virtually and in person. Together, we were able to address challenges and opportunities in preventing and responding to discrimination in our city. And we were able to focus the day on topics like supporting transgender and gender nonconforming communities, immigration protections, understanding the Fair Chance Housing Act, and we were able to break out into smaller groups to discuss strategies to uphold our law. And the feedback we've gotten back has been overwhelmingly positive. And so I'm just, in one hand, just reeling from the success of the event and also really excited for the ways that we can expand it in the future. But I wanted to spend some time here together talking about the different things that happened throughout that day. And I'll start off by just asking both of you your overall thoughts on the day.
Yeah, what a cool event. This is, I'm only a few months working in city government, so it was really cool to see so many stakeholders from across the city come together and collaborate. And we talked about barriers to collaboration other than really cool spaces like this and how we can keep in touch going forward, and just sort of what we're anticipating in terms of threats to different rights that are protected in our human rights law and what we can do next. So it was a really great experience.
It's increasingly rare to be in community with people in person. And so there was some energy just around bringing together community advocates and government agencies that they work with or have partnered with in the past and thinking about what partnership can look like. So I overheard some other people at my table just talking about how they were walking away feeling hopeful and empowered to think about the work and where this work goes. Obviously, things like the human rights law in New York City and civil rights law in the U.S. have a long history and have had ups and downs in terms of their strength and when they're needed. But I think it was really inspiring just to hear both individuals who have been impacted by discrimination and the nonprofits and legal service providers and city agencies who are there to think about not only how do we address discrimination when it occurs, but how do we prevent it in the future.
One of the sessions that we hosted during the summit was titled Advancing Immigrant Rights in New York City, and it was moderated by Stephanie Rivera, who is our Assistant Commissioner for Litigation and Pre-Complaint Operations. I think myself and everyone at the event was floored at how impactful this panel was. It was a dynamic discussion on safeguarding immigrant rights in New York City. The conversation explored how organizations address social, economic, and legal challenges, as well as foster inclusivity and influence policy. The panel dove deep into impactful advocacy efforts, partnerships, and how the public can help build a more inclusive community. And in none of these panels, we didn't do them on our own. We had partners. Here we had partners from the Mayor's Office on Immigrant Affairs. We had partners from NGBV, and then for the Latino Justice Project, talking about immigrant concerns at different levels. Joanne, you got to facilitate a panel, which was also amazing.
The people who spoke on my panel were amazing indeed, and it was exciting. This was really the first chance where we had a panel discussion on the city's new Fair Chance Housing Law, which prevents housing providers from discriminating against applicants and current tenants based on their criminal history. So we had speakers who had worked on different versions of the bill historically and talked about some of how they worked in coalition to move the legislation forward, but also really the personal reasons that people were fighting for this law and what it looks like to have a human right to housing, which is housing for everyone, regardless of background and identity, be safe and accessible, something I think we all want. And sometimes we tell advocacy stories and it's about the coalition building and not necessarily about changing the law, but this was about both. Some of the advocates were from the Osborne Association and the Fortune Society, as well as a more grassroots campaign that was brought together to seek more fair and just policies for people with criminal records.
I know we've talked about it a couple of times on the show, but for anyone who hasn't heard about Fair Chance Housing, do you want to just give them the brief intro of like, hey, this is the elevator pitch on Fair Chance Housing?
Yes. The elevator pitch on Fair Chance Housing is that the New York City human rights law now places guardrails on when and how housing providers can ask about or consider criminal history. So I think one of the most important things to know is that most New York City housing providers are covered. There are some exceptions for federally and state subsidized housing, and there's some exceptions for very small housing, so buildings with 2 units or less with some caveats. So that's important. The second important thing to know is that those housing providers that don't fall into those exceptions can only ask about a very limited number of convictions that have happened in someone's past. So housing providers can never ask about things like arrests or pending cases or something on a criminal history that hasn't been adjudicated in full, i.e. there hasn't been a determination made. Point 3, very important to know about the Fair Chance Housing Law. While there are a few convictions you can ask about, you can't ask about those things until after you've considered someone's general housing eligibility and made them a conditional offer of housing. So that means that housing providers are really looking at general qualifications and not turning someone away because they see something historical on a record. We know that there has in the past, both in employment and housing, been prevalent bias and assumptions about people based on criminal histories, which are often not evidence-based assumptions. And so this is really about leveling a playing field and ensuring everyone is looked at using the same criteria. And the idea is that there are some convictions a housing provider can look at after the conditional offer of housing. And then there's a process if a housing provider decides they're not sure if they want to rent to someone based on something in their history. They let the person know, and the person has an opportunity to explain their qualifications for tenancy, as well as any other supporting evidence of rehabilitation or anything else they want a housing provider to know as they consider their application. So there's both kind of process and substantive protections in the law. One really important thing for folks out there to know, both housing providers and applicants or tenants, is that before running a criminal background check, a housing provider has to let you know they're going to do that, and they have to share a notice of rights that was created by the Human Rights Commission, and that is on our website. So we have a wealth of information, I will say, on the website about this law. We will be running a campaign, break down barriers to housing in the coming months, so you'll see it all over New York City. We have trainings, FAQs, and we're excited to talk more as the law kind of rolls out and we see what's happening on the ground.
Going back to the summit, we ended the day where we broke out into smaller groups, and Leela, you got to facilitate one of those groups. You want to talk about that exercise?
Yes, of course. Yeah, it was a really exciting opportunity for me. We were calling it a dreaming session in a lot of ways because people got to envision what a future could look like completely free of discrimination. If there are no barriers or guardrails, what would we want to see in our communities? So I think like sort of freeing ourselves from the burdens that we might be thinking about on a daily basis at the beginning was really helpful. It was a really interactive session. I led the LGBTQI working group, and we discussed barriers, resources, and were able to brainstorm sort of actionable solutions to ensure that no one is left behind in the communities that we each individually support in our workplaces. In my working group, we built off a lot of what Matt shared at the beginning of the summit, and something we discussed as like an actionable thing that we could do was to sort of advocate for gender neutral bathrooms in workplaces that we don't see that visible, to sort of make that more of a visible thing so people from communities that don't fit into one of those two gender segregated bathrooms feel seen. It was a really great opportunity to just collaborate with people from different city government agencies.
Awesome. And now, Leela, since you're joining us for the first time, we're going to ask you some questions.
Oh, I'm excited.
So the first one, the inaugural question for any guest, is what is your favorite thing to do in New York City?
My favorite thing to do is to go into Chinatown and have a dim sum feast. My favorite thing to get is the eggplant stuffed with shrimp or the sesame balls. And since Chinatown is so close to work, I go there all the time.
Dim sum is so fun and so dangerous because you just keep ordering things and you're just like, this is so delicious. And then you get the bill and you're like, oh my God,
Well.
how much did I eat? It's so amazing. Leela, you've been here for, 4 months? And in that time, you've just done a really good job of like integrating yourself into the commission's work and culture. We got very, very lucky with our urban fellow. What brought you to CCHR? What made this the right agency for you for your fellowship?
Thank you so much for that question. And yeah, I'm happy to give a little bit of context about myself and how I got here to New York City. So I was raised in Columbia, Missouri, and became really interested in civil and human rights issues at a pretty young age. I would call both of my parents kind of activisty people. And I learned, I think, most of my lessons from my great aunt, who was a really amazing civil rights champion, and she actually helped draft the educational framework for India when it was first getting its independence. So she was a huge, huge inspiration for me and really taught me to always look inward and confront the political and social issues that might be happening within my own community, which is something I tried to do a lot in Missouri, but then also sort of took those lessons when I went to Occidental College, which is in Los Angeles. And when I was there, I collaborated with a research group that was focused on environmental justice issues. And there we interviewed 70 different women, immigrant women across the United States, about their experiences with colorism. And that was just a really personal project for me because I've had family members who've experienced colorism and have used skin lightening creams because of colorism. So I got to better understand how skin lightening creams and the usage of those is an environmental justice issue because they can have sort of harmful ingredients in them, but also sort of the messaging that different women have heard growing up that sort of facilitates this issue of colorism. So I learned a lot about sort of community-led advocacy in that space, but I wanted to know what sort of like higher level policy change looks like. So I was able to intern with the International Planned Parenthood Federation for a semester where I worked as a United Nations liaison. And there I got to see some really interesting negotiations happening and how people sort of advocated for their country positions. And that was also a really meaningful opportunity. But I kind of missed seeing the direct, tangible change that those resolutions were making. So city government seemed like the solution for me. So I applied to the Urban Fellows program to learn what sort of policy change might look like on that more localized level. I'm really grateful to have been placed with the Commission on Human Rights, especially because the protections in New York City were so broad, and it was so inspiring to see how that legal framework existed, maybe in comparison to the place that I grew up in Missouri, as well as like seeing color as a specific protection that was outlined in the law was really cool and sort of had a through line to my passions during undergrad. Also, during my time here, I've been able to see how the Commission really adapts to new laws that are coming out, such as the Fair Chance Housing Law, and how the team has been able to sort of message that law and make it accessible for New Yorkers to understand. And being a part of projects like that has made me only want to web that into my career trajectory in the future, wanting to make laws and people's rights accessible and breaking down those barriers.
It's been great to see your contributions to the Commission in the time you've been here, and really cannot say how lucky we are to have you as our Urban Fellow. One of the things that we didn't talk about from the summit, we also had a presentation from our public artist in residence, Caitlin McCain, who we are going to have on a future episode of the radio show. Her work is really interesting because it's trying to center art and advocacy and talk about all the ways that advocacy and art intersect. I know, Leela, you've been working with Caitlin really closely. Do you want to talk a little bit about her work and what we've been doing thus far?
Yeah, she really centers a participatory framework in a lot of the work she does, understanding the positionality that she carries going into spaces. She's done a lot of really engaging and cool youth work, helping them build their skills in theater and advocacy. So yeah, we're very excited to have her, and it was great to have her at the summit.
Joanne, you also get to work with Leela every day. She's part of your team. Any context you want to add in this frame?
What you've said, Jose, which is that it's been really amazing to have someone who comes with local government experience, but also international experience. I think the work we do at the Commission is very grounded in international human rights principles, and we're thinking every day about what Leela was saying. How do we make this work accessible? My team is lawyer heavy, so it's always good to have policy-oriented additions and to think together about how to do our work better and differently.
steering a little bit away from the summit, we did another second annual thing this year in January. We hosted our second annual Martin Luther King Day of Action. Members of our Community Relations Bureau were out on January 24th. Our staff was out across all 5 boroughs sharing vital information about New Yorkers' rights under the human rights law. One of the reasons why I want to mention this is because events like these are a powerful reminder of the impact we can have when we work together. We share out information. We talk about how bias and hate are never tolerable in New York City. This is just our everyday work, but we're out that day in force across all 5 boroughs at once. Any closing thoughts from either of you before we wrap it up?
Obviously, it's the middle of winter, but yesterday I was out in Coney Island and I went to the beach, and the boardwalk was actually pretty crowded. And it's a whole different ballgame to go out to Coney Island and the beach in the winter. So I recommend it. It felt very peaceful.
I don't think I've ever been to Coney Island not in the summer. So interesting.
Happy Lunar New Year to all those that celebrate.
Happy Lunar New Year. That's all we have for you today, folks. February is Black History Month, so we'll have more content for you all next month, so don't forget to tune in. Again, we want to remind you that if you have experienced or witnessed discrimination, contact the Commission to report it. You can report discrimination online at nyc.gov/humanrights or by calling us at 212-416-0197. Thank you for tuning in to Rights Here, Rights Now. Remember that we all must work together to create a city where New Yorkers can live, work, and thrive free from discrimination. See you next time.